All right, we've talked a good bit about the problems with the future of the budget, and we've looked at discretionary versus non-discretionary spending to see what the trends are like in the future. But now we want to shift and put a little more focus on what exactly the expenditures are in our federal budget. So we're going to look at just kind of the things that the United States has to spend its money on. So we have a very expensive government in the United States. It has a lot of land to take care of, a lot of services to provide, and a lot of people to deal with. And so our government has a very expensive budget. And that budget is growing all the time, like we've been talking about. So in 2016, the amount of money spent was 3.25 trillion, which is a crazy amount of money to think about. In 2020, that number has doubled. So in just 4 years, that number has doubled. Now we'll see if 2020 is an outlier, because 2020, of course, was the year when we had the COVID pandemic. And so there is definitely more government spending than usual to try to solve that problem. But it looks like in just 4 years, we have doubled the size of the federal budget. So we can see, and this was Trump's plan for the 2020 budget. We can see some of the areas where his administration wanted to spend more money, which was veterans, homeland security, defense, and treasury, and a lot of areas where he wanted to cut spending, which would be like international programs, transportation, housing, urban development, education, and agriculture. So a lot of agencies ended up with less funding, and very few agencies ending up with more. And that kind of goes back to what we were looking at in the charts to see how there was less and less spending available for all of the programs of the government. All right, so we looked at this a little bit earlier. We've got 70% of the country's spending as non-discretionary. And that's the net interest plus the mandatory spending that you see in the chart on the right. The chart on the left breaks down what that mandatory spending is. That's the health programs, Medicare and Medicaid. It's Social Security. It's other programs like disability, retirement for our military, things like that. And the thing is, with each of those areas of spending, we can't control how much money is spent on those programs, right? We can't control how sick people get and use Medicare more. We can't control the number of old people. We can't control the number of people that have retired. So let's go back to the chart on the right. 15% of that spending that's left over. So we have 30% of the spending, and 15% of that goes toward defense. There's a lot of reasons why it is unpopular to reduce defense spending, and this is the main thing that conservatives want to increase or maintain. And so there's a lot of pressure to keep defense spending where it is. So everything else in the federal government fights over 15% of the whole revenue of the United States. So you can see that broken down in the chart on the right. Some of that money goes towards health, some towards transportation, some towards education. And that means everything else is now fighting over 9% of the budget. So we have a smaller and smaller chunk of the budget to work with for all of our government programs. So this chart shows us a little bit of the breakdown of how those decisions about the discretionary spending are made. So this is just taking the 15% chunk of the federal budget that is not defense discretionary spending. So this is discretionary spending, but not the defense side. So spend about $100 billion a year on transportation, right? That's like roads, airports, ports, all kinds of stuff like that. 72 billion on education, a lot on veterans benefits, a lot on health in general. I'm sure that number will be going up as a result of the pandemic, but things like the CDC, like pandemic planning, monitoring like disease spread and stuff like that. The Justice Department, so that is all the law enforcement in the country, is like $60 billion. International affairs, like $50 billion. Gets smaller and smaller chunks for like natural resources and environment, for housing, for community and regional development, for science, space, and technology, and then for training, employment, and social services. So all of these other functions of the government are fighting over a smaller and smaller chunk of the budget. and there's less and less for them to work with. The other problems with our budget are based on what we call incrementalism. Incrementalism means that we're going to consistently change a little bit at a time instead of having like major changes all at once. So this happens in policy and it happens in our budget as well. What this means for our budget is that expenditures tend to increase a little bit every year. So our budget is probably going to go up by a little bit every single year. Every agency that's out there, they assume that they're going to get this year's budget and a little extra for next year. So agencies actually like work to spend all of their budget, because if they don't use all of their budget, then they worry about reduced budgets in the future. So agencies like government programs have incentives to spend all of the money that was allotted to them. And so each agency assumes that next year's budget is going to have a little bit of an increase over this year's budget. The other thing is, once programs are in place, people like them, and it's hard to take them away. Once you've given something to the public, it's hard to take that program away from the people and tell them that now that's something that you have to pay for. So when the government cuts programs, that becomes unpopular. There's so many different interests that rely on those programs. So like, it would be difficult now to get rid of something like Social Security, because so many people rely on Social Security. People plan their whole life expecting Social Security to be an income for them when they're old. And so it's hard to take that away. So there's a lot of pressures here to keep the government spending where it is or increased. The other reason for incrementalism is that the budget process is complicated. We talked about that process. It takes a very long time. You've got Congress to deal with, president to deal with, all the agencies to deal with. And so it would be ridiculous to start the budget from scratch every single year. That would be like the only thing that Congress did. So basically, when we start the budget process every year, we are starting with last year's budget. No one starts from scratch when they start figuring out the priorities of the federal budget. They're going to take the budget from the year before and make changes to it. And so that's why incrementalism is going to continue to take place, is the budget process is so complicated. So instead of like starting from scratch and rethinking our priorities, we're kind of stuck working with the budget that we have and then trying to make changes to it. But for the reasons we just talked about, it's very difficult to like cut things and to make changes that reduce programs or benefits that go out to the public. So all that gets debated in the budget process are like minimal increases or minimal cuts. And they end up, the cuts are extremely difficult to pass in a vote on the budget. All right, here's our friend President Trump. He wants you to think about your own budget and wants to encourage you when you're making your spending decisions to eat Goya beans and Goya coconut milk and some cookies here. So we'll take President Trump's advice and let's focus on those things that we need to make sure we remember from this set of notes. All right, the main thing we want to make sure we can do today is compare discretionary and non-discretionary spending. We want to make sure that we can explain the difference between those things, like that the government makes choices about discretionary spending, but non-discretionary spending, they don't get to control. And that's another part of what we need to explain. We have to explain why mandatory spending is growing. So we need to be able to explain things like, we've promised to give income to old people, but we cannot control the number of old people. We need to describe the impact of entitlement programs in the budget. Think about that chart where those will soon be equal to the amount of all the revenue the government brings in. So the more the entitlement programs take up, the less money there is for all of the other government programs to fight over. And then we want to make sure that we can explain how incrementalism contributes to the budget increasing every year. All right, that's it for federal expenditures. So we've looked at revenue, we've looked at expenditures, we know how the budget works. Now we're going to take a deeper look into how the United States makes decisions about economic planning. So what does the government do to try to make sure that the economy performs well?